नमस्तुभ्यं वरदे कामरूपिणी विद्यारम्भं करिष्यामि सिद्धिर्भवतु मे सदा पद्मपत्रविशालाक्षी पद्मकेसरवर्णिनी नित्यं पद्मालयां देवी सा मां पातु सरस्वती भगवती निःशेषजाड्यापहा।
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second session of our ISCI Physics webinar series. I hope you enjoyed our last session. For those of you who missed it, it's available on the ISCI website. You all can go and listen to it, and so that there's a link with this lecture. We'll continue with our topic of general physics this time. We'll move on to basic cardiac MR sequences. We have with us our speaker, Dr. Pudyavan, who is the cardiothoracic radiologist at Koe Medical College in Coimbatore. And our senior mentor for today is Dr. Sanjaya Vishwamitra. Hello, sir. He is the chairman of ISCI and ex-president of ISCI. Today, Pudyavan will be talking on basic sequences with inputs from Dr. Sanjaya. Any questions, please send them to us on the chat box. About the next lecture, I'll update you as we end our session. Over to you, Pudyavan.
Thank you, Richa. Thank you, Sanjay, sir. Okay. Okay. So welcome back to this ISCI Physics webinar series. So we are into session 2. And the session 2 will be on MR physics and particularly the pulse sequences, which are the building blocks of MRI, if I can say so. And so before I go into it, very short recap of our last session. So in the last session, we saw about all the hardware that are needed for MR, cardiac MR in general, the magnets, the types of magnets, and the RF coils. Then we saw what is nuclear magnetic resonance, the property of the protons to behave themselves as a small magnet when they are placed in an external magnetic field. Then we saw about MR image formation and the importance of gradients in signal localization. And coming to MR image formation, there were 4 basic steps in them, and we went through them. The first is the excitation, where an RF pulse is given and the proton absorbs the energy and gets excited into a higher power state. And after that, the process of relaxation takes place, where the proton again jumps from the high energy state to its resting state. And in this process, it releases energy in the form of RF pulse, which is received by us and is converted into an image. And we also saw how an important role gradient coils play in signal localization in MR. So we have 3 gradient coils, and each one of these gradient coils are used for selecting a particular slice. And in that slice, second gradient is used for phase encoding, and the third gradient is used for frequency encoding. And once all these three gradients are applied, then we get something like this, a grid work of different voxels, each having its own phase difference and its own frequency, so that we exactly know from where that particular signal is coming from. So now we have got an MR signal with us. We have given an RF pulse, and we have got back a MR signal from the RF signal from the proton in the body. But this is not sufficient for image formation. So when we get the signal from the protons, we are faced with a problem. So what happens is that, so I told you there are two relaxation processes that happen simultaneously, T1 and T2 relaxation. T2 relaxation is a much faster process, and T1 relaxation is a relatively slower process. So T2 relaxation, as I told, there is loss of phase coherence between the protons when T2 relaxation happens. So this follows this process of loss of phase coherence of the protons immediately after an RF pulse is given is called as the free induction decay. So the signal which starts out at maximum rapidly loses its amplitude because the protons become incoherent, or there is no phase coherence between the protons. So this process is called as a free induction decay. And this process poses a problem because immediately after an RF pulse is stopped, the free induction decay starts immediately. So it doesn't give us enough time for us to sample the signal, especially when we are, suppose this is the point at which the RF pulse is stopped. So immediately the dephasing of the proton stops, and the amplitude of the signal also drops exponentially. So it gives us very less time to sample this signal. And the point at which we start sampling the signal, somewhere around here, the amplitude of the signal is already got much lower. So we have lost a lot of signal beforehand before we could even sample this signal. And this process of free induction decay is also much more accentuated in real world scenario because the T2 decay is much faster owing to the small magnetic field inhomogeneities that are present inside the body. So apart from the, so all these assumptions of free induction decay are based on the assumption that the main magnetic field is a homogeneous field. But in reality, though it is a homogeneous field, there is some amount of magnetic field inhomogeneity which is microscopic, that is present inside the body because of the elements that are present in the vicinity of the protons. And this magnetic field inhomogeneities causes a T2 decay that is much faster than the theoretical free induction decay that we will be seeing. So this is called as the T2 star effect, which is nothing but the accentuated T2 decay of the protons in the presence of environmental microscopic field inhomogeneities and chemical shifts is called as the T2 star effect. So, so we saw the problem. So to overcome this problem, we use something called as a pulse sequences. So a pulse sequence is nothing but a sequence of events which is used to acquire an MR image. So I'll just go through the step-by-step process. So first, we switch on the slice selection gradient, which is the this one. The first is the slice selection gradient for selecting a particular slice, and simultaneously a 90-degree RF pulse is given. And once this RF pulse is given and stopped, the free induction decay starts to happen. And during this process, we give the phase encoding gradient. And when the signal is sampled, we give the frequency encoding gradient, also called as the readout gradient. So here is the problem that we spoke about. So because of the free induction decay, once we have given the phase encoding gradient and we come to the readout gradient, the signal is already come to a very minimal amplitude. So there is very less signal for us to sample. So this results in a very poor quality image because the image is starved of signal because of the T2 decay that happens much faster. So because of this free induction decay, we are not able to sample the full amplitude of the signal when we are giving the readout or the frequency gradient. So to overcome this bottleneck, we do something called as a pulse sequence, where we use a sequence of events to accentuate this signal. So the first and the most simple of these sequences is the spin echo sequence. So in spin echo sequence, what we do is that after the 90-degree RF pulse, we give a 180-degree inversion pulse. So what this 180-degree pulse does is that this 180-degree pulse inverts the protons that undergo free induction decay. So once there is rephasing of these protons happens, the protons which were losing signals, losing phase coherence, will again start to gain phase coherence, and at one point all the protons will be in phase with each other. And when all the protons are in phase, then we get the highest amplitude of signal, which is called as an echo. So what basically happens here is that, so I've told you that once the RF pulse is given and stopped, the protons which are in phase together starts to dephase. That means that, so I gave you an analogy of a march past, where the phase coherence between the protons becomes less and less as time goes by, and after a particular period of time, there is complete phase incoherence between the protons. So what we do with this 180-degree pulse is that what it does is that it flips the protons by creating a phase flip. So when there is a phase flip, what happens is that the protons which were dephasing starts to rephase. There is a very good example of this phenomenon which was explained in simple words in a beautiful book, MRI Made Easy. So how they explain this 180-degree pulse phase rephasing is that, imagine that there is a running race and all the participants are at the starting line. And once the start whistle is given, everyone starts to run. But everyone cannot run at the same pace. So one will be running faster and one will be running slower. So this difference in the running speed of the runners is the difference in phase coherence between the protons. So after say 10 seconds or 20 seconds, we give another whistle and ask the runners to again turn back and run towards the start line. So what happens now is that the fastest runner will be farthest away from the starting line, and the slowest runner will be very much closer to the starting line. And once he turns around and then again start running without losing any speed, then what happens is that after the same 10 seconds of duration from which we gave the second whistle, all the runners will be again coming to the start line at the same point in time. So this is the phenomenon where all the runners have again come in phase to each other. So they were in phase to start with, and once they started running, they became out of phase, or there was loss of phase coherence. And once we asked them to turn back and run again towards the start line, then after a particular period in time, they will all again meet one another again at the start line, where they have become in phase with each other. So this is the phenomenon. This is what the 180-degree RF pulse basically does to the protons during the spin echo sequence. So what we do is we give a 90-degree pulse. The protons are deflected to the XY plane, and immediately after the 90-degree pulse, all the protons are in phase. And after that, they start to dephase rapidly. And once the dephasing starts, we again give another 180-degree RF pulse, which flips the phase, and instead of dephasing, they will again start to rephase. And once the rephasing starts, they will all again gain phase and become in phase at a particular point in time. So the important thing to understand here is that the time between the 90-degree pulse and the 180-degree pulse is equal to the time between the 180-degree pulse and the time at which all the protons will be in phase. So suppose if you give the 180-degree pulse at say 20 milliseconds after the 90-degree pulse, then exactly 20 milliseconds after the 180-degree pulse, all the protons will again come in phase. So by this process, we exactly know at what time the protons will be in phase with each other, so that the highest amplitude signal can be obtained from these protons. This also gives us time to run the phase selection and the frequency or the readout gradients. So we two processes takes place. So we give the 90-degree pulse and the 180-degree pulse, and we exactly know at what time the echo or the maximum amplitude signal will be obtained, because this time between 90 and 180-degree will be equal to the time of 180-degree and the echo. And exactly at that point in time, we can give the readout gradient or the frequency encoding gradient, and we can get the maximum amplitude signal. So this is the basic of how a spin echo sequence happens. So what are the advantages of a spin echo sequence is that a spin echo sequence has a very high signal to noise ratio. So because the 180-degree pulse makes all the protons to come in phase, the signal that comes from the protons has the highest amplitude, and hence the signal to noise ratio is very high. And this is also very less susceptible to magnetic field inhomogeneity because of the 180-degree pulse that is used. The disadvantage of using a spin echo sequence is that it is time consuming, because we are not only using one 90-degree RF pulse, but we are also using another 180-degree RF pulse. So we'll have to, the time taken, when the number of RF pulses that are given increases, the time taken for the image acquisition also increases. And again, there is high RF deposition. So there are 2 radio frequency pulses that are given for every single spin echo sequence. So this results in a higher radio frequency deposition, which can again produce a rise in temperature in the patient. So though that may not be much important in a practical standpoint, but still it is a disadvantage where there is a high RF deposition because of the spin echo sequence. So before we move any further, so we will need to know a few terminologies as far as pulse sequences are considered. So the first is the TR time, or the time to repetition. So the time to repetition is nothing but the time between one 90-degree RF pulse and the next 90-degree RF pulse. So this next 90-degree RF pulse is given for the next pulse sequence. So when we are acquiring an image, we give multiple 90-degree RF pulses to acquire an image. So the TR time is the time between one 90-degree RF pulse and another 90-degree RF pulse. And the TE time is the time to echo. So the time to echo is the time between the 90-degree RF pulse and the time at which the signal or the echo is obtained. So as I told, the time to echo is exactly bisected by the 180-degree RF pulse. So the time taken, the time between the 90-degree and the 180-degree RF pulse is exactly equal to the time between 180-degree pulse and the signal generation or the echo generation. And third parameter is the flip angle. So till now, we have assumed that these 90-degree pulse that we are saying, a 90-degree pulse is nothing but an RF frequency pulse that flips the magnetization by 90 degrees. And we need not use a 90-degree flip angle all the time. So we can use a flip angle from 1 degrees up to 180 degrees, anywhere in this range. So the flip angle in this example is a 90-degree flip angle, but we can use a flip angle of any degree depending on the sequence. So these three are the very basic parameters that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about pulse sequences. So why is these parameters very important? So this is because the image contrast depends on these parameters. So in a spin echo sequence, the image contrast is dependent on the TR time and the TE time. The time to repetition and the time to echo are the two parameters which determines the image contrast. So by image contrast, what we mean that whether it will turn out to be a T1 weighted image or a T2 weighted image or a proton density image. So that depends on the TR and the TE time. So when we use a short TR and a short TE time, we get a T1 weighted image. And when we use a long TR and a long TE, we get a T2 weighted image. Sorry. And when we use a long TR with a short TE, we get a proton density image. Now we will see why is this so? Why the change in TR and TE produces different image contrasts. So first, coming to T1 contrast. So a T1 weighted image needs a short TR and a short TE. So these two images, I hope you guys are familiar with these images. So this is nothing but the T1 T2 relaxation curve, and this is the T1 relaxation curve. So in T2 relaxation curve, so as I told you, immediately after the RF pulse, all the protons are in phase and it will have the maximum amplitude, and it will start to dephase immediately after the RF pulse and it will come to zero. Whereas in T1 relaxation, what happens is that immediately after the RF pulse, the magnetization is flipped into the XY plane. So there is zero magnetization along the main magnetic field. And with time, the magnetization is regained by the protons and it reaches the magnetization that is equivalent to the main magnetic field. So when we use a short TR and a short TE, what happens is that immediately after the RF pulse is given, so when a short TE is used, there is hardly any difference in the dephasing or relaxation of the protons in the T2 relaxation curve. But whereas when in the T1 relaxation curve, the difference between the T1 curves of different materials has the greatest difference immediately after the RF pulse. So with time, what happens is that all the T1 relaxation curve of all these tissues will reach the maximum value, and the difference between different tissues will cease to exist as time goes by. But whereas in a T2 relaxation curve, the immediately after the RF pulse, since all the protons are in coherence, there is hardly any difference in the T2 relaxation of different tissues. Whereas with time, the dephasing of the protons vary from one tissue to another. And this is basically the phenomenon that I told you in the last class, that each protons dephase at a different rate depending on to which element that proton is attached to. So if the proton is in water, it will dephase at a different rate. If the proton is in fat, it will dephase in a different rate. If the proton is in the myocardial muscle, then it will dephase at a different rate. So this difference in dephasing of the protons is what we use to produce the image contrast in MRI. So here, when we use a short TR and a short TE, there is hardly any difference in the T2 relaxation curves, but there is a great difference in the T1 relaxation curve of different tissues. So this results in a heavily T1 weighted image. So when we say that an image is T1 weighted, it just means that the T1 contrast is predominant in that particular image, which means that that image has the characteristics of a T1 relaxation curve more than a T2 relaxation curve. Coming to T2 contrast, it is the same again, but here we are using a long TR and a long TE. So the same T2 relaxation and the T1 relaxation curve, but we are using a longer TE and a longer TR. So when we use a longer TE, the difference in the rate at which the protons dephase will become greater and greater as time progresses. So the rate of dephasing of different tissues will also be different and will produce different kinds of signal. Whereas in a T1 relaxation curve, as time progresses, all the protons in all the tissues will start gaining the magnetization along the Z magnetic field, and after some time all the protons would have gained maximum amount of magnetization along the Z magnetic field, and so there will be hardly any difference in the magnetization of protons in different tissues. So when we use a long TR and a long TE, what happens is that the weightage of T1 relaxation curve on the image is minimal, whereas the weightage of the T2 relaxation curve is maximum in an image when we use a long TR and long TE. So hence this particular image that we obtain when we give a long TR and long TE is called as a T2 weighted image. There is something else also called as proton density contrast, or the PD contrast, where we use a long TR and a short TE. So since it uses a long TR and a short TE, neither the T2 relaxation has happened, so that there is not much dephasing of protons, and a long TR will result in all the protons reaching the end Z magnetization. So this kind of image will not depend on either the T1 relaxation nor the T2 relaxation. So this image will have neither T1 nor T2 weightage. Rather, the contrast of the image purely depends on the density of protons. So any tissue with a higher density of protons will give higher signal without any difference in the T1 and T2 relaxation characteristics of that particular tissue. So this image where we get which we get with a long TR and a short TE is called as a proton density contrast image. So as I told you, for spin echo sequence, the image contrast depends on the TR time and the TE time. So shorter TR and shorter TE will give T1 weighted image. A longer TR and a longer TE will give a T2 weighted image, and a longer TR and a shorter TE will give an image with neither T1 nor T2 weightage but a proton density image. So this is the basic of a simple spin echo sequence. I invite Sanjay sir to add so if I have something left out, and we'll also just have a quick look at any questions that have been asked in this up to this session.
Thank you, Pradhivan. I think you've made again something a little complex into a relatively simple discussion. But I'm just going to ask you to put some numbers to what you discussed, just so that to give people an understanding of what you would define as, say, a long TR versus a short TR, long TE versus a short TE. Okay, so for a spin echo or a fast spin echo sequence.
Yeah, so any TR in the range of 1000 or 2000 is a long TR, and TE times are always shorter, because I told that the T2 relaxation is a much faster process, whereas the T1 relaxation is a longer process. So the TR times will always be longer compared to TE time. A short TE is something like 5 or 10 milliseconds, whereas a longer TE is something in the range of 100 milliseconds is called as a 100 or 150 milliseconds is called as a longer TE time. Whereas TR time of less than 500 is called as the shorter TR time, whereas the longer TR time will be around 1000 or 2000 milliseconds.
So to put that into perspective, would you say that a T1 contrast is typically achieved when you have a TR of about less than 1000 milliseconds and a TE of close to about 10 milliseconds or less?
10 milliseconds, yeah, yes.
And T2 contrast is achieved when the TR is typically much longer, let's say
Much
3,000,
longer.
4,000 milliseconds, and the
Exactly.
TE is at least 60 to 70 milliseconds and above.
Maybe around 100 milliseconds. Yeah, yes, exactly.
And we all have good experiences with having different types of waiting in even within this process of T2 waiting. So you have intermediate T2 waiting when it's say between 100 and 150 milliseconds. You have longer T2 waiting close to 200, and you have very long T2 waiting, say in an MRCP sequence when you are close to say 400, 500 milliseconds.
Yeah.
Also, sorry, go ahead, Padya.
Yes. So, we need to. So the point is that playing around with the TR and TE can get you the desired contrast for an image. But at the same time, changing the TR and TE will change the contrast altogether. So too much fiddling into the TR and T, especially for a practical purpose when we are doing a sequence, is not very ideal, is what I feel. Okay, fair enough. There's one question which says, what is the cause for T1 and T2 relaxation? So what actually causes the protons to want to get back to their natural state? So I think I explained it during our first talk. So what happens is that when an RF pulse is given, the protons absorb that energy and go into a high energy state. So the protons will not like to be in a high energy state for a longer time. So as soon as the RF pulse is stopped, the protons will always want to come to the equilibrium or the low energy state. So when the proton comes from the high energy to the low energy or the equilibrium state, two processes take place which happens simultaneously. So that is the T1 and the T2 relaxation process. So the T1 relaxation is the acquiring the magnetic field along the main magnetic field or along the z-axis, whereas T2 relaxation is the dephasing of the protons that happens immediately after the RF pulse. So both these processes happen simultaneously but are independent of each other. Right. I sometimes think of them as children, Pudhiyavan. Like when you want to have a class and you have say 30 children in a class or 60 children in a class, you bring them into the class, and then when they're in the class, they're all fidgety, they're all facing in all different directions. Then you have a teacher come into the teacher's your RF pulse. And when as long as the RF pulse is there, the students are all facing front. And once the teacher turns his back or basically goes out of the classroom, the students start fidgeting again and start dephasing within the classroom itself. So that's your loss of T2 contrast. Yes. And then some of the students slowly start getting out of the classroom as well. And basically because their natural state is to be out in the playing field. So that becomes the the regaining of T1 contrast. That's another way of thinking about it. Thank you, Pudhiyavan. Can you continue with your presentation? Yeah, sure. So so from this, so next set of sequences is the gradient sequences or gradient echo sequences. So why was gradient echo sequences needed? So one most important drawback of a spin echo sequence is that it is a time consuming sequence. So you give an 90-degree RF pulse, then again you give another 180-degree RF pulse, wait for the rephasing to happen, and then you acquire the image. So this was a time consuming process and we needed faster sequences. So for that purpose, we brought about something called as a gradient echo sequences, which used the gradient reversal to produce an echo instead of a 180-degree pulse. So what happened here is that RF pulse is given. So you can notice that here it is not given as a 90-degree pulse, but rather an alpha. So alpha is nothing but the flip angle. So it can either be a 90-degree pulse or it can be a 40-degree pulse or a 20-degree pulse. So it can vary from 1 to 180 degrees. So we will just assume that this is also a 90-degree pulse. So a 90-degree pulse is given. So there is the magnetization is flipped into the XY axis, and immediately after the RF pulse is stopped, the dephasing of the protons starts. So here, like in spin echo sequence, instead of using an 180-degree pulse, we use a gradient reversal. So gradient is applied in opposite directions. So what this gradient reversal does is that it modifies the dephasing of the protons in such a way that the protons which were dephasing at a faster rate start to dephase at a slower rate, and the protons which were dephasing at a slower rate will start to dephase at a faster rate. So when this gradient reversal is done, the protons will again then start to come in phase with each other, and there will be a point at which there will be phase coherence between all the protons. So similar to the example that I explained below with the runners, you can take the same example. So the runners have started running, and the fastest person is farthest from the starting line, and the slowest person is closest to the starting line. So now, instead of asking the runners to turn back and run towards the starting line, we say that the fastest person runs at the pace of the slowest person, and the slowest person runs at the pace of the fastest person. So after this, what happens is that after a particular point in time, the slowest person who was slowest in the first attempt will start to catch up with the faster person, and at one point all the runners will be again coming into a same single line. So at that point we say that all the runners are in phase, or all the protons are in phase. So the main objective of the pulse sequences is to make all the protons to come in phase, so that we can get the maximum amplitude signal from the body. So here we use a gradient reversal to make all the protons to come in phase. The one major difference between a spin echo sequence and a gradient echo sequence is that in a gradient echo sequence, the image contrast depends on the flip angle and the TE time rather than the TR time. So the TR time has no say in the image contrast when we are using a gradient echo sequence. So in a gradient echo sequence, very short flip angle and a longer TE will produce T2 weightage, whereas a larger flip angle and a shorter TE will produce a T1 weightage. And a short flip angle with short TE will produce a PD weightage, because there is not enough time or the flip of the magnetization to produce either T1 nor T2 weightage. So the image contrast, contrary to the spin echo sequence, in gradient echo sequence depends on the flip angle and the time to echo. We saw that gradient echo sequence is a good way to speed up things. So there are a lot of other ways we can speed up things. That means speed up the acquisition of an MR image. So one such thing is the multi-slice sequence or an SMS sequence, where what we do here is that, so once we give a 90-degree pulse, a 180-degree pulse, and an echo is obtained. Suppose we are looking at a to T2 weighted image. So the TR time has to be around 2000 or 3000 milliseconds. But the 180-degree pulse is given at around, say, 60 or 70 milliseconds, and we get the echo at around 140 to 150 milliseconds. But from 150 milliseconds up to the 2000 or 3000 milliseconds, we practically do nothing. We just wait for the TR time to get over, so that we can give another 90-degree pulse and start the next sequence. So what they decided is that instead of just sitting idle for such a long time and wasting time, what we can do is we can give another 90-degree RF pulse, but with a different slice selection gradient. So what happens is that once a slice is excited and the relaxation happens in the slice and the echo is obtained in that slice, we immediately follow it up with a 90-degree pulse with a different slice selection gradient. And after that, another 90-degree pulse with a still different slice selection gradient. So what happens here is that we are obtaining data from multiple slices simultaneously instead of waiting for the TR time to get over in a single slice. So by this method, the scan duration, the complete scan duration will get reduced by the factor of how many slices of image data we are acquiring. Similar to this, there is something called as a multi-echo sequence, which is nothing but, again, so we have given a 90-degree pulse, a 180-degree pulse, and an echo is generated. But after this echo is generated, though the T2 relaxation, after this echo, the T2 relaxation and the T1 relaxation still happens like normally it will do after a 90-degree pulse. So what we do is we start giving multiple 180-degree pulses and start generating echo or signals for each and every 180-degree pulse. So in this type of sequence is called as a multi-echo sequence. So there is something called as an echo train length or a turbo factor, which is nothing but the number of 180-degree pulse that is given within a single TR period. So this is a 90-degree pulse. This is another 90-degree pulse. So this will be the TR of this sequence. So now here for the first acquisition, this will be the TE time. For the second acquisition, this will still be the primary 90-degree pulse. So the TE time will be from here to here. And if we give another 180-degree pulse, then the TE time will be from here to that particular echo. So what we do here is that we obtain multiple image sets from a single TR time. So this will help us in doing more phase encoding steps in a single TR time, and this will also improve the spatial resolution as well as the signal to noise ratio, because we are getting multiple echo signals from a single TR. This multi-echo sequence also reduces the susceptibility effects of magnetic field inhomogeneities. So a multi-echo sequence can also be used when there is an implant. So, but the problem here is that since the TE time keeps on varying with each and every signal, the image contrast is a complex contrast. So it will not be a pure T2 weighted image. This is because when for the first echo, the TE time may be around 5 milliseconds. For the second echo, the TE time will become 7 milliseconds. For the third echo, the TE time will become 10 or 15 milliseconds. So what happens is that though the TR time remains constant for this sequence, the TE time will be varying. So because of this varying TE time, a multi-echo sequence will have a complex image contrast. So some examples of these multi-echo sequences are the FSC or the TSC sequences, or turbo spin echo sequence, the Hayes sequence, the sequences that are used for MRCP. So these are all multi-echo based sequences where we use multiple echoes within a single TR time. So sorry. So this results in a since the with progressing time, the TE time also keeps on increasing. So the image contrast of these multi-echo sequences will be predominantly of a T2 weightage. And when you use a very long echo train length, for example, echo train length of even up to 200 can be used, meaning that within a single TR time, we can give up to 200 180-degree pulses to obtain 200 echo signals. So in those cases, the TR time of the later part of the TE time of the later part of the sequences will also be prolonged. So what you get is a very heavily T2 weighted image. So this is much helpful in cases of doing MRCP for visualizing the ducts where the water is stagnant. So coming to the multi-echo sequence can also be used with a gradient sequence. So instead of giving multiple 180-degree pulses, we can do multiple gradient reversals also to obtain an image. But since the gradient reversal depends on the dephasing of the protons, what happens is that multiple gradient reversals cannot be perpetually given like 180-degree pulses that we use in a multi-echo sequence based on a spin echo sequence. So here the number of echoes that are possible are mostly from 3 to 4 echoes, and this kind of multi-echo sequence in a gradient sequence is mainly used in in-phase and out-phase imaging, and it can also be used in gradient T2 weighted sequences like MEDIC sequences, which are used in spine. So what happens here is that the first gradient reversal will produce a signal, then again a gradient reversal is done, and as you can see, the signal strength keeps on decreasing because of the T2 star effect, which causes rapid dephasing of the protons in the tissue. So the multi-echo gradient sequence cannot use a very long echo train or a very long turbo factor. Coming to another important sequence, that is inversion recovery sequence, or the IR sequence. So IR sequence is basically a spin echo sequence. But what we do here is that we introduce a separate 180-degree pulse before the 90-degree RF pulse that is given in a routine spin echo sequence. And why this 180-degree pulse is given? This 180-degree pulse is given to modify the image contrast. So by which way we are modifying this image contrast? So what happens is that when the first 180-degree pulse is given, the magnetization which was in the direction of the z-axis in the positive direction gets flipped into the negative direction. And from here, what happens is that, like any other RF pulse, once the RF pulse is stopped, the protons will always want to gain their magnetic field along the z-axis. So they will start gaining the magnetization and will start to, so this is the T1 relaxation that happens. So the T1 relaxation will start to gain magnetization along the z-axis in the positive direction, and it will reach the resting state. But the rate at which this happens will differ for different tissues. So all the protons in different tissues will not gain the magnetization at the same rate. So a fat will gain magnetization much faster when compared to the protons in water in CSF. So in inversion recovery sequence, we exploit this property of the protons so that suppose a 180-degree pulse is given, and the after the 180-degree pulse, the magnetization starts to grow along the z-axis. At one point, if you see, the magnetization will reach 0 before again gaining the magnetization along the plus direction of the z magnetic field. Suppose if a 90-degree RF pulse is given exactly at this point, at which the fat is crossing the 0 threshold, the fat will not be affected by the 90-degree pulse. So whatever 90-degree pulse that we give at this particular point in time will not excite the protons that are present in fat. Hence, the protons that are present in fat, since they are not getting excited by the 90-degree pulse, will not give out any signal. So as a spin echo sequence that is run at this point in time will produce an image with a contrast where signal from fat is completely nulled. Similarly, if you do a spin echo sequence at exactly this point where the protons in water molecules are crossing the 0 threshold and going into the plus direction of the Z magnetization. So at this particular point, when the magnetization of the protons in water is 0, they will not be influenced by the 90-degree RF pulse that is being applied. So what happens, since there is no excitation of protons in water, they will not be able to produce any signal. So there will be no signal from the protons in water. So you will get an image with an image contrast where all the signal from the water is completely suppressed or nulled. So this is the main use of using a inversion recovery sequence where a particular signal from a particular tissue is nulled or suppressed so that we get different image contrasts. So there are different types of inversion recovery sequence. An inversion recovery sequence. So before I go into the different types, so there is a parameter called as a TI time or time to inversion. So this is nothing but the time between the 180-degree pulse and the 90-degree RF pulse. So this is called as an inversion time. So if you give an inversion time that is equivalent to the point at which fat is at 0, then you will get an image where fat is completely suppressed. So that is called as a stir image or a short tau inversion recovery sequence. In the same way, if you give an inversion time at which the CSF or the water protons are at 0, then you will get a signal where the image contrast will have no signal from water molecules, and you will get something called as flare image or a CSF or a water suppressed image. So the basic differences between these three main sequences, the spin echo sequence, the gradient echo sequence, and the inversion recovery sequence. So in spin echo sequence, the advantages are that it produces high signal because there is a 180-degree pulse for refocusing the protons. It has little effect. The magnetic field inhomogeneities have little effect, and you get what is called as a real T1 and T2 weightage with a spin echo sequence. The disadvantage is that it produces, since we use 2 RF pulses, there is high rate of RF deposition. The scan times are much longer, and since the scan times are longer, there is more chances for motion related artifacts. Whereas in gradient echo sequence, since we use only one RF pulse with a particular flip angle, the RF deposition is low, and since we use a gradient reversal instead of an 180-degree pulse, the scan times are also much shorter. And gradient echo sequences really opens up the possibility of doing dynamic imaging. And we will see the basic sequences that are used for cardiac MR, and we will see that most of these, all the cine sequences or the white blood sequences that we use are basically gradient echo sequences because they are much faster. The disadvantage of a gradient echo sequence is that it produces low signal because the gradient reversal, though produces an echo, there is a loss of signal exponentially because of the free induction decay, and the magnetic field inhomogeneities related T2 star effects are more pronounced in gradient echo sequence. Coming to inversion recovery sequence. So inversion recovery sequence is nothing but a spin echo sequence. We just have a extra 180-degree pulse before the 90-degree pulse so that we can get a desired image contrast. So it will have the all the advantages of a spin echo sequence and the disadvantages of the spin echo sequences as well. So the SNR will be high, and it will also give you the avenue to suppress each different tissues specifically, whereas the disadvantage again will be the high RF deposition and the very long scan times that are associated with these inversion recovery sequences. This is about the different sequences. So we saw about spin echo sequence. Then we wanted to speed up things, so we did gradient echo sequence, and we also did multi-echo and multi-slice imaging, and we also saw about specific image contrast using inversion recovery pulses. And now Sanjay sir, you want to add a few things?
Yeah, so let us, I think you again.
So you are,
sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, sir.
So you've introduced all these sequences. So let's try to put it into a practical perspective again. So can you give me an example of a sequence that we use for cardiac MRI, which is a fast spin echo sequence?
So most of the black blood images that we do are all fast spin echo sequences. So the black blood image that we do for routine screening of the thorax, or the T1 and T2 weighted images, which we use, is also a spin echo sequence, but it has a small modification in that in a normal black blood spin echo sequence, though the signal from the blood is null, there is often a kind of a ghosting artifact, because the blood flow is not through plane always. There will be some amount of in-plane blood flow, especially within the cardiac chambers. So the nulling of the blood is not very good when we use just a black blood or a FSC or a TSC sequence. So for that purpose, we incorporate a kind of an inversion recovery sequence into it, so that we can null the signal from the blood also, so that we get true spin echo contrast in those sequences. But basically, all the black blood sequences that we use in cardiac MR are all spin echo sequences, and there are a few spin echo black blood sequences which also uses a couple of inversion recovery pulses just to null the signal that is coming from the blood.
And can you give me an example of the gradient echo sequence that we normally use?
Again, so gradient echo sequences again are all the white blood sequences are all gradient echo sequences. So that is because the cine sequences that we use needs a really fast imaging time. So we do the cine sequences in say 5, 6, or 7 seconds. So in these 7 seconds, the system has to acquire image of the heart from the entire cardiac cycle to give us a cine image. So what we do is we do a sequence which is much faster, and which can take place at a very short flip angle. So when we use a very short flip angle, so as I told you about the image contrast of gradient echo sequences, when the flip angle is very short, then you tend to get a T2 weightage more rather than T1 weightage. So that's the reason that most of our cine sequences are white blood, in the sense when we see the cine sequences, it looks more towards a T2 weighted image rather than a T1 weighted image. That is because all the cine sequences are gradient echo sequences with a very short flip angle to make it very faster, so that inherently these cine sequences have a predominant T2 weightage rather than a T1 weightage.
You also gave a very nice example already of the inversion sequence. You mentioned that an inversion recovery pulse is often used to suppress blood. So dark blood imaging or is a IR sequence is typically used for that. Can you give us another example of how an inversion recovery sequence is a very powerful sequence for cardiac imaging?
The other very important application of an inversion recovery sequence is in delayed enhancement. So delayed enhancement is the cornerstone for cardiac MR imaging, and it is invariably used in most of our studies. It is a very important sequence. So what happens in delayed enhancement is that we look for abnormal myocardial enhancement. So the word abnormal here is very important, because the myocardium will normally enhance. So it will take up gadolinium, it will enhance. But we are only worried about abnormal enhancement of the myocardium and not the normal enhancement of the myocardium. So what happens is that when we are qualitatively looking at MR images, especially the post-contrast images, it might become difficult to differentiate an area of abnormal enhancement from an area of normal enhancement. So in late gadolinium enhancement images, what we do is we use an inversion recovery pulse to suppress the signal that is coming from the normally enhancing myocardium, so that the abnormal areas are very well visualized, or visualized in a striking manner. So as I told you, the inversion time depends on the tissue in which which we are supposed to null. So for example, if you want to null water, then there is a specific TI time for a given field strength. If you want to null fat, there is a specific TI time for a given field strength. But when we are going to null normally enhancing myocardium, there is no single specific TI time that can null all the myocardium in all the patients. So that's the reason we do TI scout image. So to find out what is the exact inversion time of this particular enhancing myocardium, give that particular TI time in the delayed enhancement sequence, so that normally enhancing myocardium is nulled and only the abnormally enhancing areas are visualized in the delayed enhancement sequence.
So you walked us over in the last 1 hour, you walked us through what T1 contrast is, what T2 contrast is. You walked us through how T2 contrast is typically controlled by the echo time, and longer echo times give you more T2 contrast, and how T1 contrast is typically controlled by the repetition time, or TR. Short repetition times controls T1 contrast. And you mentioned how combinations, therefore, for a T1 weighted image is to minimize T2 contrast by having short TEs and maximize T1 contrast by having relatively short TRs, and vice versa for the T2 contrast. And then you walked us through the multiple different sequences that are used, and then you gave us some practical examples also in terms of how they're actually used in cardiac imaging. The one question that was there was in terms of the multi-slice sequences, and what exactly multi-slice means. And the question, I think, was, does it mean that you're getting two different contrasts, or do you just get multiple slices of the same contrast?
No, we are in multi-slice technique, we are getting multiple slices of the same contrast, whereas in multi-echo technique, we are getting multiple contrasts of the same slice. So in multi-echo technique, we combine the data that is coming from all these different 180-degree pulses or the different echoes. So we get a complex contrast with different TE times. So a multi-echo technique is a single slice with different contrasts, whereas a multi-slice technique is different slices with the same contrast.
Excellent, Padivan. That's very nicely explained. Just as a question, so what happens to all these echoes? Where do all these echoes go? And what can we look forward to perhaps in the next lecture as to what's happening to these echoes that are being generated by the magnet?
Okay, so, before that, I'll just go through a couple of more slides.
Sure.
I'll just show the listeners the various terminologies that are frequently used when we are imaging, and I will come back to that particular question. The sequence parameters. So we have seen TRT and flip angle. So we know what it is. So we'll also try to understand what happens when we change these parameters. So the TR time, also called as the repetition time. So when you increase the TR time, so the T1 contrast is reduced, and with increasing TR time, the signal amplitude will also increase. But the downside of increasing the TR time very high is that the scan duration also increases, because we'll have to wait for the TR time before we give the next 90-degree pulse. So coming to TE time, or the time to echo. So you increase the TE time, there will be more T2 contrast. And with increasing TE time, the signal amplitude will also starts to drop. This is because with increasing time, the signal free induction decay happens much faster, and you are left with very little signal for you to rephase the signal. Coming to flip angle. So flip angle determines the image contrast in gradient echo sequences. Flip angle doesn't have a role in image contrast in the spin echo sequence, as the same way the TR time doesn't have a say in the image contrast in gradient echo sequence. And increasing the flip angle will produce more T1 contrast, whereas a very small flip angle will produce more T2 contrast. And increasing the flip angle will also increase the signal amplitude. So for example, if there is a 90-degree pulse, will obviously produce more signal than a 10-degree pulse, because there is more time for the T2 relaxation and the T1 relaxation to happen. So this is the T time. Okay. So coming to inversion time, or the TI time. So increasing the TI time will result in more contrast, more signal, But however, as I told you, the TA inversion time is a constant for a given field strength. So too much variation in inversion time will change the image contrast. For example, if you increase the TA time too much, then instead of suppressing fat, the signal will suppress signal from the water. The other parameter that we often encounter is the number of acquisitions or number of excitations. So this is nothing but how many times we repeat a particular signal to obtain the image data. So suppose we image the same slice, single slice once, and the signal that we are obtaining is not sufficient to give us a good quality image. What we can do is repeat the same sequence at the same slice multiple times, and all these signals are averaged together to produce a much better signal strength and a much better image. So increasing the number of acquisitions will obviously increase the signal strength and the SNR. The noise will be reduced. Artifacts will be fewer because of there is more signal that is available for reconstruction. However, the increasing the number of acquisitions will also increase the time. And one more important thing that we have to keep in mind while using the while increasing the number of acquisitions or number of excitations while doing the scan is that there will be an increase in a twice increase in the number of acquisitions will increase the scan duration by twofold, but will increase the SNR by only root of 2, which is around 1.4. So for example, there is a sequence which takes 10 seconds to complete, and you are not happy with the image quality or the signal is very poor. So you decide to increase the number of averages to 2. So when you increase the number of averages to 2, the scan time will increase to 20 seconds, but it is not necessary that the SNR will also have to increase to 2. The SNR will only increase by 1.4 fold. If you want to increase the SNR also twice, then you will have to do the repeat the scan for 4 times and image for 40 seconds. So whenever you are increasing the number of acquisitions in your machine to get good quality image, keep this in mind that a double increase in number of acquisitions will only result in increase in signal by root of that particular number of acquisitions. Coming to matrix, so the matrix determines the spatial resolution of the image. So an increase in matrix size will result in a reduction in voxel size. So when the FOV is constant, an increase in matrix size. So suppose this is a 10 by 10 matrix, and here we have increased it into a 20 by 20 matrix. So when the matrix size is increased without changing the FOV, then there is a reduction in voxel size. So once there is a reduction in voxel size, the signal per voxel also reduces. So there will be more noise in the image. However, you will get a higher spatial resolution. And since the number of voxels have increased, the scan duration will also increase. So when you are scanning and you are trying to increase the spatial resolution, keep that in your mind that whenever you increase the spatial resolution, keeping the FOV constant, the noise will also increase because the amount of signal that is coming from a single voxel reduces. So to overcome this, then you will have to increase the number of signal averages, which will again increase the scan duration. Coming to field of view. So an increase in field of view without a change in matrix size will obviously increase the voxel size. And also it will produce a higher signal per voxel. However, the spatial resolution of the image will go down. So whenever you are increasing the field of view, the amount of signal that you are obtaining from the image will also increase at the expense of a poorer spatial resolution. So if you're not very keen on spatial resolution, then you can just increase the FOV. Otherwise, if you want a good spatial resolution and if you want to increase the FOV, then you will have to increase the matrix size also. Coming to slice thickness, an increasing slice thickness obviously will increase the signal because the voxel size increases. However, the spatial resolution is lowered. And also increasing the slice thickness to a larger level will introduce partial volume effect. The advantage of this is increasing the slice thickness will be that you can cover a larger area. So a 10 millimeter slice can cover 1 centimeter with just 10 slices, whereas a 5 millimeter slice thickness, you'll need 20 slices to cover the same 10 centimeter of area. And there is something called as a slice gap. So slice gap is the distance between two slices. So before I explain slice gap, we should understand one phenomenon that in MR, so suppose this is one slice and this is the second slice and images is obtained. The acquisition of image is not, ideally it should be like this. So you get data from all data from this entire slice. Then the second slice, you should get data from this entire slice. But since slice selection gradient uses change in magnetic field strength, so it will not be very clear cut like this. So in reality, when you're doing a slice selection gradient, what you get is you get the data from the slice like a bell curve. So you get more information from the center of the slice and very less information from the sides of the slice. So when you're imaging in MR, you will lose out a lot of data at the edges of both the slices when you are doing a routine MR sequence. So this is the reason we try to reduce the slice gap as much as possible so that there is no data that is left out. But reducing the slice gap too much will result in a phenomenon called as a crosstalk. So crosstalk is nothing but, so we use a slice selection gradient for this particular slice and a different slice selection gradient for this particular slice. But when there is an overlap of tissue between these two slices, then these slices will be excited by the gradient, the RF pulses that are coming from both these slices. So there will be a amount of data that is being shared between these two slices, which introduces an artifact into the image. So to avoid this, we should use a slice gap of at least 10 to 20% of the slice thickness. So slice gap of minimum of 20 to 20% of the slice thickness will give you the maximum amount of data without much gap between the slices. At the same time, we'll also try to avoid the phenomenon of crosstalk. Coming to phase oversampling, this is another parameter that we often encounter in our machine. So phase oversampling is done when we use a smaller FOV than the object that is scanned. So what happens here is that when a FOV is placed in the imaging plane, which is smaller than the body, so the phase encoding that happens in the during the pulse sequence will start from one end and go to the other end. But the phase encoding doesn't stop at the end of the FOV. The phase encoding will start to grow along both the directions outside the FOV also. So at this point, the phase difference between the photons can only vary from 1 to 360 degrees. So once the 360 degree phase encoding is finished, then the system will automatically start encoding the next voxel with a phase encoding of 1, 2, 3, and so on. So if the FOV is smaller and there is a phase encoding that is happening outside the FOV, so the image, the data that is coming from this particular point and this particular point will be put in the same voxel in the image that is generated. So this will result in something called as a phase wrap artifact, where the image that is present on the left hand side of the FOV is placed on the right hand side of the image. So this is called as a phase wrap. So to prevent phase wrap, we do something called as phase oversampling, where we put a larger FOV covering the entire body part that has to be scanned, but the image generation uses only the signal that is coming from this part, whereas the phase encoding happens from this phase encoding happens from this end to this end. So this will result in a elimination of the phase wrap artifact. But the problem with this is that it increases scan time. So though the image is generated only of this portion, we are still giving phase encoding from this point up to this point. So it is practically takes the same time as imaging the entire body part that has to be imaged. Another importance of phase encoding is that the motion artifacts that we often encounter always happen in the direction of the phase encoding gradient. Suppose if the phase encoding gradient is in the antero-posterior direction, then the motion artifacts will appear in the antero-posterior direction. And if it is in the right to left direction, it will happen in the right to left direction. So this can be exploited by us. So suppose there is a pulsation artifact from the aorta, and there is a pathology right in front of the aorta. So what we can do is we can use a phase encoding direction of right to left, so that the pulsation artifact happens from right to left, and the pathology here doesn't fall on the area where the artifact is occurring. Or suppose if there is a para-aortic pathology, then we can use a phase encoding direction of antero-posterior, so that the artifact also happens in the antero-posterior direction, and the pathology that has to be imaged is not obscured by the artifact. So you have to be familiar with these parameters so that you can modify these parameters while you're scanning it to get a good quality image. To conclude, we just saw how a rapid decay of signal happens after the RF pulse is given. So this requires a sequence of events to acquire these images. We saw about spin echo sequence, which uses a 180-degree refocusing pulse, a gradient echo sequence, which uses a gradient polarity reversal to produce the same signal. Then we saw about inversion recovery sequence, which used a 180-degree inversion pulse to get specific image contrast. Then we saw that the image contrast depends on a lot of parameters like the TR and TE in spin echo sequence, flip angle and TE in gradient echo sequence, and the inversion time in inversion recovery sequences. And we should also try to acquire knowledge of few of these parameters which we saw, so that we can apply these to improve the image quality. And to conclude and to come back to what Sanjay sir was asking me, so we have given a RF pulse, we have run pulse sequence, and we have also gotten a signal back. So what happens to the signal? Does the signal directly give us an image, or how the image is produced by the signal that we obtained from the body? So the signal that we obtained from the body is nothing but a radio frequency pulse. So the radio frequency pulse is nothing but a kind of a small magnetic field. So a magnetic field that is being emitted as energy by the proton is received by the receiver coils, which converts that magnetic field into a small electric current. So that electric current is then taken up, and this small electric current that comes from the receiver coils is then converted into image. So how this small electric current, which is nothing but a flow of few electrons here and there, is converted into an image. I think Sanjay sir can take over on this.
Yeah, so I think some of these concepts have been very nicely discussed, Pudhiyavan. I think we need to basically wait for the next lecture to see what happens to all of these echoes and how that actually gets put together in a manner that we can all understand. I think your last couple of slides were very important. And, it seemed rather dry to a lot of people when they're first hearing it. But it becomes very important because particularly with cardiac imaging, cardiac MRI, we're always constantly playing around with what we call temporal resolution, spatial resolution, the ability to get more signal back from our images, at the same time getting the patient to hold his or her breath for the entire period of time. And of course, all of this needs to be accomplished within a certain ECG RR interval. So I would suggest to all of the audience to please go back and review the concepts on your own and come back next time. So back to Richa to discuss what's going to happen next. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pudyavan and Dr. Sanjaya. Excellent lecture and very good discussion. Very detailed and clear. So for everyone, we're going to go ahead with this general physics, where Dr. Sanjaya will take the next talk on what happens once we get the echoes, where, about case space and parallel imaging techniques. The next webinar is on 10th March at 8 p.m. We'll be again sending you all the links, just like this time. There's one question about the book you mentioned in between, Pudyavan, MRI Made Easy. You meant to say it by Dr. Govind Chauhan, right? That same one, no?
No, this is another one. I'll just share it in the IACI group, the book. Sure.
Sure. So see you everyone. Next lecture is on 10th March. We'll keep you all updated. And the previous talks, so last talk and this one will also be uploaded on the IACI website. You can go to the iaciind.org and go to events, and in webinars, we have these Pearls of Physics monthly webinars, which will get uploaded. This talk will get uploaded this week, but last month's talk is already there. You all can go and revise it before attending the further lectures. Because all the talks are kind of interrelated, because we started from the basic general physics and we'll be going to more and more advanced. Thank you, everyone. See you next month.
Thank you, Richa. Thank you, Sanjay sir.